Welcome to the Sleepy Historian.
Hello friends, this video is about how people celebrated Christmas in the American frontier. Imagine a world where the snow outside is untouched, the air is crisp with winter's bite, and the warm glow of a fire is the center of family life. The frontier at Christmas time was a place of quiet resilience and humble joy. A season not of grand displays, but of simple, heartfelt moments. In the small cabins scattered across the wide American wilderness, the holiday season was both a cherished break from the year's hard labor and a rare opportunity for neighbors and family to gather. For many, the first signs of Christmas came not from shop windows or printed advertisements, but from the subtle shift in the season, the early sunsets, the way the cold deepened, and how the world outside seemed to grow still. Winter on the frontier could be unforgiving. Heavy snowfalls and frigid winds made daily life a challenge. Yet, for those living in these remote places, Christmas was not just a holiday. It was a vital moment of connection and tradition. Preparations would begin weeks in advance, as families found creative ways to make the season special with what they had. Children eagerly waited for the day, though their gifts were often modest. A handmade doll, a carved wooden toy, perhaps a knitted scarf. Each item carried the mark of love and labor. A father might spend hours in the barn, shaping a small sled from leftover wood, while a mother stitched a dress from fabric saved over the year. These gifts were not wrapped in bright paper, but often left by the hearth or under a small evergreen branch brought indoors. Christmas trees, when they appeared, were often modest, a pine or spruce cut from nearby woods. They were decorated with whatever the family could craft: strings of popcorn, hand-cut paper ornaments, dried berries, or even gingerbread cookies tied with ribbon. The scent of evergreen mixed with the warm aroma of wood smoke and whatever special meal was simmering in the pot. About halfway through the day's preparations, there might be a moment for rest, and perhaps now is a good time for me to say, if you enjoy these gentle journeys into the past, consider subscribing to join us for more. The world of history is vast and comforting, especially when told slowly, like a story by the fire. On Christmas Eve, many frontier families would gather for evening prayers or sing carols passed down through generations. These were not the grand church choirs of the cities, but small, heartfelt voices filling the quiet of the night. Sometimes neighbors would join in, arriving by sled or on horseback, bundled in layers of wool and fur. The sound of their approach, the crunch of snow, the jingle of harness bells, added to the magic of the evening. As night fell, the cabin would be lit not by strings of lights, but by candles, lanterns, and the fire's glow. Shadows danced along the walls, and the warmth of the room contrasted sharply with the cold outside. In that moment, the frontier cabin was a world unto itself, a haven of light, warmth, and togetherness in the midst of a vast, frozen land. Families would share stories, sometimes humorous, sometimes deeply nostalgic. The older generation might tell of past winters, of long journeys through snow to be with loved ones, or of the first Christmas they spent in a new home on the frontier. These tales reminded everyone that Christmas was not about abundance, but about endurance, memory, and hope. As children drifted to sleep, some curled up by the hearth, others sharing small beds under heavy quilts, the adults would quietly prepare for the next day. Stockings, if they were hung, might be filled with small treasures: a piece of candy, a coin, a pair of knitted mittens. Outside, the snow would keep falling, muffling the world in a peaceful hush. In the American frontier, Christmas was more than a holiday. It was a moment of unity against the cold, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, warmth could be found in the company of others. And for those living far from the bustling cities, this quiet joy was perhaps the most precious gift of all. When the morning of Christmas Day arrived on the frontier, the first light of dawn often came through frosted window panes, casting soft patterns on the wooden floors. The cabin would be colder than usual in the early hours, the fire having burned low through the night. Before anything else, someone, often the father or eldest son, would rise quietly to stoke the embers, coaxing the flames back to life. The crackle of kindling and the gradual spread of warmth marked the true beginning of the day. Outside, the world was still and white. Snow clung to the bare branches of the trees, and smoke rose in thin columns from neighboring cabins, signaling that other families, too, were waking to their Christmas morning. The air was sharp and clean, carrying the faint scent of pine from nearby woods. For children, the morning was filled with anticipation. They would hurry to the hearth or to the small evergreen branch that served as their Christmas tree. The sight of a handmade doll, a carved toy, or perhaps a small pouch of sweets brought smiles that no store-bought gift could match. In many homes, there was a tradition of sharing one special treat, perhaps a piece of preserved fruit, a rare luxury on the frontier. Breakfast on Christmas morning was often heartier than usual, prepared from ingredients that had been carefully saved for the occasion. Cornbread, fresh from the skillet, might be served with butter or molasses. There could be smoked meat, eggs, or hot porridge sweetened with honey. The warm smell of food filled the cabin, mingling with the scent of evergreen and wood smoke. After breakfast, some families attended church if there was one nearby. This could mean bundling up for a long, cold journey on foot, horseback, or in a sled pulled by horses. The church service itself was simple, often held in a small wooden building or even in someone's home. The hymns were familiar, sung slowly and with feeling, the voices blending in a way that made the room seem warmer. For others, the day was spent entirely at home or visiting neighbors. Hospitality was an important part of frontier life, and it was common for families to open their doors to travelers or those without kin nearby. A guest might arrive with nothing but a smile and leave with a full belly and a warmer heart. The Christmas meal was the centerpiece of the day. It was not the extravagant feast seen in wealthier homes back east, but it was rich in meaning. Venison or roast fowl might be served, accompanied by root vegetables, fresh bread, and pies made from preserved apples or berries. The portions were generous, for this was a day to eat well and celebrate abundance, however modest it might be. During the afternoon, children played in the snow, their laughter carrying through the crisp air. They built forts, rolled snow into lumpy snowmen, or took turns sliding down small hills on makeshift sleds. Meanwhile, the adults gathered indoors, sipping warm drinks, often coffee, tea, or mulled cider if they were lucky enough to have the spices. Conversations drifted from the year's hardships to hopes for the year ahead. On the frontier, each winter was a test, and each Christmas was a victory over the long months of labor and survival. Sharing the day with others reinforced the bonds between neighbors, making the challenges of the season feel lighter. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow across the snowy fields, preparations for the evening's gathering began. Lanterns were lit, more wood was brought in for the fire, and food was set out again for late visitors. In the quiet moments between tasks, families would pause to simply enjoy the peace of the day, the warmth of the fire, the closeness of loved ones, and the knowledge that they were not alone in the vast, untamed land. In these simple yet profound ways, Christmas on the American frontier was a celebration of survival, community, and the enduring human spirit. It was a reminder that joy could be found not in what one had, but in who one shared it with. By the time Christmas afternoon settled in, the heart of the holiday was no longer in the excitement of the morning gifts or the meal, but in the slower, gentler moments that followed. The cabin's fire burned brightly now, filling the room with a steady warmth, while outside, the light began its slow winter fade. The shadows lengthened, and the snow caught the low sun in shades of gold and rose. Inside, The smallest children, worn out from playing in the snow, might curl up near the hearth, drifting into peaceful naps under heavy quilts. Their dreams were colored by the simple joys of the day, the laughter of neighbors, the taste of sweet molasses, the sound of carols sung in warm, crowded rooms. Adults often used this quieter time to share stories. On the frontier, storytelling was as much a tradition as the holiday itself. Families would recount tales of their first winters in the territory, long journeys taken in deep snow, or even the hardships that had tested them in years past. These stories were not told to dwell on struggle, but to remind each other of their resilience. Many of these recollections involved Christmases gone by, how a storm once trapped a family in their cabin for days, how neighbors banded together to hunt for food, or how one small gift had meant the world to a child. The retelling of these moments strengthened bonds and kept alive a sense of shared history. In some homes, music filled the afternoon. A fiddle, harmonica, or simple handmade drum might accompany voices singing folk songs and hymns. The melodies were often imperfect, but heartfelt, and the sound carried through the cabin, softening the harshness of winter. For those lucky enough to own an instrument, it became a centerpiece of the celebration, passed from one player to the next. Around this time, visitors might arrive, neighbors who had finished their own meals, or travelers who had been making their way through the snow. A knock at the door would be met with smiles and an open invitation to join in. Chairs were pulled closer to the fire, mugs of warm drink were offered, and another plate of food was always found for a guest, no matter how modest the household supplies. And perhaps now is the right moment to say, if these quiet, gentle glimpses into history bring you comfort, consider joining us here again. There's a seat for you by the fire in every story we tell, and countless journeys still to take. For the children, a guest's arrival was often a thrill. New faces meant new stories, and sometimes new games. They might play simple games like I Spy, or take turns telling riddles. Even in the most remote cabins, laughter had a way of filling the room on Christmas. Outside, the snow sometimes fell again in the late afternoon, soft flakes drifting lazily from the gray sky. Through the small window panes, the world looked hushed and timeless, as if the land itself was pausing to share in the holiday. The creak of the wind through the trees, the occasional whinny of a horse in the barn, and the steady crackle of the fire were the soundtrack of the frontier Christmas. As evening approached, preparations began for the final celebration of the day. Candles were trimmed, lanterns filled with oil, and the largest logs were placed on the fire so it would burn bright through the night. The cabin glowed with a warm light that made the cold and darkness outside seem impossibly far away. It was in these hours, when the work was done, the guests were gathered, and the air was filled with the mingled smells of pine, wood smoke, and food, that the true magic of Christmas on the frontier could be felt. It was a magic born of togetherness, of enduring another year in a hard land, and of finding beauty in life's simplest pleasures. As dusk fell across the wide frontier, the world outside took on a hushed, almost sacred stillness. The snow reflected the last light of day, giving the land a faint glow, while above, the first stars began to pierce the winter sky. In the distance, the dark line of the forest stood silent, and the only movement was the drifting smoke from cabin chimneys. Inside, however, the air was alive with warmth and motion. The evening gathering was about to begin, and every surface seemed to hold something. Platters of food, mugs waiting to be filled, or simple handmade decorations fashioned from pine cones, berries, and scraps of cloth. The table, though humble, looked inviting, with plates laid out for every expected guest, and perhaps even a few extra, just in case. Neighbors who lived miles apart would arrive wrapped in thick coats and scarves, stamping the snow from their boots before stepping inside. With each arrival came a rush of cold air, quickly replaced by the welcoming heat of the fire. Greetings were exchanged, and often gifts as well. Not costly or store-bought, but heartfelt. A knitted scarf, a jar of honey, a loaf of bread, or a small carving made from local wood. These small exchanges carried meaning far beyond their material worth. On the frontier, every gift represented hours of work or the careful setting aside of something precious. A jar of preserved berries might have been saved for months, a length of cloth woven during long winter nights, or a carving shaped in secret as the snow fell outside. The meal that followed was often served in stages, stretching well into the evening. There might be roast venison, brought down in a recent hunt, or a goose, plucked and prepared for this special night. Alongside, it were dishes made from what the land and careful planning could provide. Root vegetables roasted with herbs, loaves of fresh bread still warm from the hearth, and pies filled with dried apples or pumpkin. Children, flushed with excitement, darted between the adults, sometimes helping to carry small plates or mugs, other times sneaking bites from the table. The older ones might be given the honor of tending the fire, a responsibility taken seriously on such a night. Music often followed the meal. A fiddle's clear, bright notes would rise above the steady hum of conversation, joined by the softer tones of a harmonica or the rhythmic tapping of spoons on the table. Songs were shared that everyone knew, their words simple and their melodies carrying a sense of belonging. Between songs, someone might tell a humorous story from a past Christmas, sending the room into laughter. Outside the windows, the night deepened. The moon, if it was full, lit the snow in silver, while the stars overhead seemed sharper in the cold air. The cabin stood as a small island of light and warmth in the vast frozen landscape. Those who stepped outside for a moment could hear the muffled sound of music and laughter spilling into the dark, blending with the quiet of the winter night. Toward the middle of the evening, there was often a pause, a moment when the room grew quieter, the firelight flickering across faces both young and old. In those pauses, people reflected on the meaning of the day. Christmas on the frontier was not about abundance in possessions, but abundance in connection to the land, to family, and to one another. Some guests would begin their journey home before the night grew too late, bundling themselves against the cold for the trip through snowy fields and forests. Others stayed until the embers burned low, reluctant to let the day end. For those who remained, there was still time for one last cup of coffee or cider, one more story, one more song before the candles were snuffed out. And when the cabin finally grew quiet, the memory of the day lingered, a warm glow against the long, cold winter still ahead. By the quiet hours after most guests had gone, the cabin felt different, not empty, but settled. The fire burned lower now, its light softer and more golden, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the deep night wrapped the land in silence, broken only by the faint rustle of the wind through bare branches and the occasional crack of ice shifting in the frozen river. For families on the frontier, the hours after the main celebration were often the most treasured. There was no rush, no noise of the outside world. Instead, people sat together, letting the warmth of the day sink in like the glow of the fire. Sometimes this was when the most heartfelt conversations happened, the kind that didn't need to be hurried or planned. The older members of the family might take this time to pass down stories that were less about celebration and more about survival. Tales of the first cabins built in the wilderness, of winters when game was scarce, or of storms that nearly took everything. These were spoken softly, not to darken the mood, but to remind the younger generation of the strength and determination it took to live here. Children, drowsy from a day of excitement, might rest their heads in a parent's lap, half listening to the stories and half dreaming of the next morning. In the low light, their faces seemed calm, safe, and timeless, as if generations past were looking back through them. For those who still had energy, there were simple tasks to tend to before bed. Boots left to dry near the hearth needed turning. The fire had to be banked with ash, so it would smolder through the night, ready to be revived in the morning. Water pails were checked to be sure they hadn't frozen. These were small but necessary rituals, grounding the family in the rhythms of life on the frontier. Occasionally, a neighbor who had stayed too late to travel home in the dark would settle in for the night. A spare bed might not exist, but quilts could be piled on the floor or over a sturdy bench, and warmth was shared without hesitation. In such moments, hospitality wasn't an act of charity, it was a way of life. Sometimes, before the final candle was blown out, someone would hum or softly sing one last carol. The sound, quiet and unhurried, seemed to settle over the room like a blanket. And in that small circle of light and warmth, with the cold pressing against the walls, it was easy to believe that the spirit of Christmas had always been this. Not glitter or grandeur, but the closeness of people who knew they needed one another to endure. Stepping outside before bed, one might look up to see the sky glittering with countless stars. The breath hung in the air like pale smoke, and the snow underfoot squeaked in the deep cold. The land was vast and still, a world both beautiful and demanding. Yet on nights like this, with the echo of laughter and music still in the air, it felt a little less lonely. Inside again, the last candle was pinched out, and the cabin sank into darkness, save for the dim glow from the hearth. The logs shifted, sending up a final spark before settling into embers. The quiet was complete now, the kind that wrapped itself around you like another layer of blankets. Christmas in the American frontier ended not with a grand finale, but with this, a deep, lasting sense of peace, woven into the long winter night. Morning on the frontier came slowly in the deep winter. The first light was pale and blue, spilling gently across the snow before touching the frosted windows of the cabin. Inside, the fire that had been banked the night before still smoldered faintly, sending up occasional wisps of smoke. It was a small comfort, proof that the home had held its warmth through the night. On Christmas morning, the air inside was filled with a quiet, almost sacred anticipation. Children woke early, their breath visible in the cool morning air, but they often stayed in their quilts for a few moments, savoring the warmth before venturing out into the main room. The smell of something cooking, coffee brewing, bread toasting on the hearth, or perhaps a pot of porridge thickening, promised that the day's celebrations were not yet over. In many families, small gifts were exchanged on Christmas morning, especially if the night before had been devoted to community gatherings. These gifts were rarely extravagant. A girl might receive a ribbon or a new pair of knitted mittens. A boy might be given a small wooden toy carved by his father, or a pouch for carrying pebbles and treasures. Adults exchanged practical items, a new knife, a hand-sewn apron, or a tin of tea leaves saved for months. What made these gifts precious was not their size or cost, but the care that went into making or acquiring them. Every stitch, every carved line, every preserved item carried the weight of time and intention. In a place where resources were limited, giving someone a piece of your effort was the truest form of generosity. After gifts came breakfast, which might be more plentiful than on an ordinary day. Pancakes made from precious flour, topped with butter churned weeks before, or perhaps drizzled with molasses or honey. There might be ham or bacon, if it had been cured earlier in the year, or eggs gathered from hens that had managed to keep laying despite the cold. On the side, jars of preserved fruit, peaches, cherries, or berries from the summer harvest were opened as a rare treat. Once breakfast was finished, some families bundled up and headed outside, even in the biting cold. Sleigh rides were a favorite pastime if horses and a sled were available. The sound of bells jingling against the quiet of the snowy forest was a kind of winter music all its own. Those without horses still found ways to enjoy the day, building snow shelters, sliding down hills on makeshift sleds, or simply taking long walks through the stillness, pointing out the tracks of deer, foxes, or rabbits in the snow. Midday often brought another round of visiting. Families would head to nearby cabins to share leftovers, sing songs, or simply sit together and enjoy each other's company. It was rare to see neighbors so often in winter, and Christmas offered an excuse to spend precious hours together. By afternoon, the short winter day began to fade again, and the golden glow of the setting sun stretched across the snow, casting long blue shadows. Inside, the fire roared once more, keeping the chill at bay. The second night of Christmas was often quieter, but no less meaningful. It was a time to reflect, to rest, and to feel the deep contentment that came from knowing you had celebrated fully, without needing more than what you had. As the second evening of Christmas settled over the frontier, the cabins once again glowed like small beacons against the dark, snowy expanse. By now, the excitement of the holiday had softened into something slower, warmer, a kind of peaceful satisfaction that came from knowing the season's traditions had been honored. Inside, the atmosphere was calm. The main chores for the day were done, the animals fed, and the fire stoked high. Families gathered not for a grand feast, but for a simpler, quieter meal. A pot of stew, simmered since morning, might be ladled into wooden bowls. Fresh bread, perhaps the last of the special loaves baked for the holiday, was broken and shared. Alongside, there could be roasted root vegetables from the cellar, sweetened with a bit of honey to make them feel like a treat. After supper, it was common for families to pull out whatever instruments they had on hand. A fiddle, a banjo, or even a simple harmonica could fill the room with gentle music. Songs were played not for performance, but for the joy of hearing them. Tunes passed down through generations, some from far-off homelands, others born in the very soil of the frontier. For those who didn't play, there was storytelling. It was in these quieter moments that children often heard tales about their own ancestors, stories of the first Christmases spent in rough log shelters, with snow drifting in through gaps in the walls, and the nearest neighbor a day's travel away. These tales weren't just entertainment. They were lessons in endurance, in gratitude, and in the simple pleasures that could still be found even in hardship. Occasionally, a small group of neighbors would make the journey to another homestead for an evening visit, carrying lanterns that swayed in the dark. The crunch of snow underfoot, the distant glow of a cabin's windows, and the sound of laughter spilling into the cold air made such visits unforgettable. In an isolated world, these connections were threads that held the community together. Children, exhausted from days of play, would curl up by the fire, sometimes falling asleep before the stories were done. Quilts were pulled up to their chins, and parents spoke in low voices so as not to wake them. The flicker of the flames played across their faces, making the moment feel timeless, as if Christmas had always been celebrated exactly this way, and always would be. Later, before turning in for the night, someone might step outside to check on the animals. The air was crisp and still, the snow crunching sharply with each step. Above, the stars glittered like frost, and the world felt both vast and close, vast in its silence, close in the way the holiday had drawn people together. The second night of Christmas on the frontier was not about spectacle. It was about the steady glow of home, the voices of loved ones nearby, and the knowledge that even in the most remote corners of the land, the spirit of the season was alive. By the third day after Christmas, the holiday's bustle had faded into memory, leaving behind a sense of gentle contentment. On the frontier, life could never pause for long. Wood still needed to be chopped, animals fed, and water hauled in from frozen streams. Yet something of the Christmas spirit lingered, like the scent of pine or the faint echo of a song still in the air. This lingering spirit was perhaps the most important gift of the season. It reminded people that even in the midst of hard labor, there was room for joy, for warmth, and for connection. In the days after Christmas, Neighbors might still stop by to return borrowed dishes or to leave a small parcel of food as thanks for hospitality. A jar of preserves, a loaf of bread, or a wedge of cheese could find its way across the snowy path from one cabin to another. Children, still flush with excitement, might gather outside to play in the snow, reenacting the sleigh rides and games from the days before. Laughter rang across the cold air, a sound that stood out brightly against the otherwise quiet winter. Sometimes they would carry the Christmas celebration in small ways, wearing their new mittens or showing off a toy carved for them by a parent. Inside the cabins, decorations, simple as they were, might stay up until the needles from the evergreen boughs began to fall. These bits of greenery, tied with strips of cloth or adorned with carved wooden stars, were reminders of the effort it took to bring beauty into such a rugged place. Evenings returned to their usual quiet rhythms. Lamps glowed, fires burned low, and families gathered to mend clothes, whittle tools, or read aloud from treasured books. But now there was a fresh store of shared memories to carry everyone through the rest of the winter. Stories of this Christmas, of the songs sung, the meals shared, and the laughter exchanged would be told again next year and the year after that, each retelling adding its own warmth to the tradition. For the people of the American frontier, Christmas was never about abundance in material things. It was about abundance in spirit, in the way the community drew together, in the care put into every handmade gift, and in the joy found in even the simplest pleasures. And when the snow deepened and the winds howled again, families would remember those bright days in the heart of winter and know that they could face whatever came next. The season had given them more than just celebration. It had given them strength.